Well, we continue this morning in our series on the parables of Jesus. And this morning we are back in the book of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Jesus says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock he did the same. And at about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' And they said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to the manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those who hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But the landowner replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am so generous?' So the last will be first, and the first will be last." Well, I always dreaded group projects in school. I didn't like them much in high school. I didn't like them in college. And I really didn't like them in seminary. I cringed when I read through a syllabus and saw there would be a group paper or presentation or project of some kind. And it's not that I didn't like my classmates or that I didn't work well with other people in general. It was simply that I knew, inevitably, a group project was going to take a lot more of my time and cause more stress than if I just did it all myself. Now, in theory, you would think the opposite would be true. After all, dividing up the workload of, say, a research paper between 3 or 4 people should make less work for each individual. However, by the time you coordinate schedules and devise a plan for the project and divvy up the work and edit each other's work and then try to piece it all back together, it takes a lot more time and energy than just doing the work yourself. And what's more, in seminary in particular, there was a broad range of academic goals among students. Some students just wanted to get their divinity degree out of the way so they could enter into professional ministry. So these students were perfectly happy with C's. Other students planned on pursuing doctoral degrees after seminary, and so A's were very, very important to them. And then there were students like me who fell somewhere in between. I wanted to do well, but I wasn't going to lose too much sleep if I didn't get a 4.0, which I didn't. So when you group students together with such a broad range of academic goals, there's bound to be some tension. The C students get upset when the A students aren't satisfied with their contribution to the project. The C students are quick to point out that they have lives outside of seminary, and grades are not the most important thing in life. But the A students get upset when the C students fail to commit the time, effort, and academic prowess that the A students think they should. And the A students bemoan the fact that everyone's grade is going to suffer from this C student's lack of pursuing excellence. After all, regardless of the individual contribution, the whole group shares the grade. Such is the economics or the economy of such exercises. Well, in our scripture lesson for today, Jesus teaches his disciples about the economics of the kingdom of heaven through this parable of the landowner and the workers. And so this morning we will explore the meaning of the parable and delve into the economy of the kingdom we belong to as followers of Jesus Christ. Well, as we've seen over the past few weeks, most of Jesus' parables, this one included, are rooted in Jesus' immediate context. And so those who heard Jesus teach this parable, or those who originally read this parable in Matthew, would be able to relate to the setting and the details of the story. But because our context is so very different, we have to first explore the setting and details so that we can get to the heart of the meaning. So, the situation Jesus describes in this parable was very, very common to his first century audience. Toward the end of September, the grapevines ripened, and the grapes had to be harvested very, very quickly because the seasonal rains arrived shortly after the grapes were ready to be picked. And if these grapes weren't harvested before these rains arrived, the fruit would rot and be ruined. And so every year, at the end of September, there was a frantic rush to harvest the grapes. And this is likely what Jesus is alluding to in the parable. And so this landowner goes to the marketplace first thing in the morning to hire workers to help harvest the crop. And then he returns to the marketplace several other times to hire even more workers because he needs to get his grapes harvested before the rains arrive. And this was a common practice in those days. Now, it's important to note that these men in the marketplace were not idlers simply loitering around or begging. Men went to the marketplace on a daily basis looking for work, hoping to be hired. I mean, these men wanted to work. You know, when I lived in the Los Angeles area, if I drove by, say, a Home Depot, I would see men gathered in the parking lot hoping to be hired by contractors to do some construction or landscaping work for the day. It was this same kind of situation. But in Jesus' context, day laborers were those who, for one reason or another, didn't own their own business or own their own land or have a family inheritance. And so they had to find work on a daily basis. If a laborer did not get hired on any particular day, this was very, very bad news for him and for his family. Because it was said that day laborers earned just enough per day to buy food for one day. A day's wage was said to be enough to provide for a day's needs. So day laborers never made enough to save very much. And so if a laborer did not get hired, this might mean he and his family were not going to eat that day. So day laborers, like the men in the story, were on a fairly low rung of the social ladder, and one that was virtually impossible to move beyond. I mean, even servants that we read about in the New Testament were considered more or less a part of a landowner's family. And so they didn't have to worry about whether or not they would have enough to eat on a daily basis. Their needs were provided for. The men we read about in the parable did not have this luxury. Now, why is this important? Well, you can imagine the relief of the men who were finally hired as the day progresses, because they know at least they're going to get something, and they're just hoping it's enough to at least feed their kids. And so this landowner hires laborers to harvest the crop. He hires a group at 6 a.m., which is when the workday began, and he agrees to pay them the usual daily wage. Then he hires a group at 9 a.m., telling them he'll pay them whatever seems right or whatever is right. Then he hires another group at noon, another group at 3, and another group at 5. And then at 6 p.m., which was the end of the Jewish workday, 6 to 6, the landowner calls his manager, says, have all the laborers come in. Now, he begins by paying the workers who started at 5 p.m., right? So those who only worked about an hour. And he pays them the usual daily wage. So he pays them for a whole day's work. And then he works his way back to those who started first in the morning. And of course, the laborers who were hired at 6 a.m. rightly assume they're going to be paid more than the usual daily wage, because those who only worked an hour got paid that. And when this turns out not to be the case, they grumble, right? They are understandably perturbed that they worked all day during the hottest portion of the day and received the same compensation as those who worked for only an hour. Now, let's be honest. If we were in that situation, if we'd worked all day, we'd be grumbling too. I mean, this very much goes against our understanding of a right and just economy, of a fair disbursement of resources. But the landowner says to the all-day laborers, friend. Okay, so he's not mad at them. Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual day's wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So we tend to focus on the apparent unfairness of this equal disbursement of the landowner's resources for less than equal time spent working. But Jesus, through the words of the landowner, instead is drawing our attention and focus to the generosity of the landowner. You see, the landowner did not have to pay anyone except those he hired at 6 a.m. the usual daily wage. He very justly could have cut the wage for each subsequent group he hired. And any typical landowner would have done that. But what have we seen so far? A laborer needed a full day's wage in order to feed his family. And so the landowner's actions demonstrate his generosity and compassion toward all of the workers. He provides every single one of them with what they need. Not necessarily what they want, but what they need. And so, truly, what this is a story about God's grace and mercy. That's the focus. That is the primary takeaway. Now, as we've seen with most of the parables, Jesus likely directed this parable at a specific group of people in his context. And so it could be that he was directing this parable toward his disciples, because at this point in Matthew, Jesus is talking to his disciples. And besides that, we know the disciples were regularly preoccupied with their own glory and place in Jesus' kingdom, right? Just before this, Peter is quick to remind Jesus that he and the other disciples left everything to follow him. They were the first investors, so to speak. They were in on the ground floor. And you remember the story of James and John, where they asked Jesus to be his number one and number two in his kingdom. And so perhaps Jesus was using this parable to teach his disciples that, hey, they would indeed receive their reward. But so will all who come to faith. All will be on equal footing when it comes to access to the mercy and grace of God. Or, some scholars have suggested Jesus was directing this parable towards his own kinsmen, the Jewish people. Because in those days, the Jewish people believed they alone would inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so perhaps this parable was meant to alert them to the fact that God, through Jesus, was opening up the kingdom to Gentiles as well. And so they ought not think that they would be the only recipients of God's mercy, even though they had labored much longer. But regardless of whether or not Jesus had a specific audience in mind, this parable conveys a truth about the kingdom of heaven that is timeless and stretches across all cultures and boundaries. And that truth is that God's compassion and mercy is the same for all who believe in Jesus, no matter when or how that happens in a person's life. In the kingdom of heaven, there is an equal measure of mercy for all. All who come to faith become equal members of the family of God. Such are the economics of the kingdom of heaven. Now, some have suggested that Jesus is referring in the parable to those who come to faith early in life versus those who come to faith somewhere in the middle versus those who come to faith on their deathbed. Now, in my opinion, that largely misses the point. I don't think it fits with the context, nor does Jesus seem to be talking explicitly about the afterlife here. As I've continually tried to stress, the faith commended to us by Jesus and others in the New Testament is not about simply what happens to us when we die. And this is important because the reward Jesus refers to here in the parable is available to us right now. Remember, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven in the present tense, indicating that through him, his kingdom has already arrived. It hasn't come to full fruition, and that won't happen until he returns, but this reward of following him can and should be experienced in this lifetime, at least in part. And so the mercy and love and compassion of God, of being in relationship with God and being transformed by his presence, is our reward right now. The mercy and compassion of God is available to every single one of us this very morning. So whether you have been a Christian your whole life and been a part of a church for decades, or if you've recently come to faith, or you've only been a part of Grace and Wesley for a short period of time, according to God's economy, we're all on equal footing here. Now, that's not to say that those who are newer to the faith have nothing to learn from those of us who are more mature in the faith, nor is it to say that those of us who are more mature in the faith don't have much to glean from the passion of those newer to the faith. And this is, I think, one of the primary applications for us. As human beings, it is very, very easy and perhaps natural for us to become jaded or cynical. I mean, can you think of a time when you started a new job you were excited about? And maybe you were just extremely thankful to have finally gotten a job, or maybe it was a job you really, really wanted. And so you were eager to use your gifts and ideas to fulfill and perhaps even improve the mission of the company. And so you start this job with the best of intentions. You have the greatest hopes. But of course, on your very first day, you encounter coworkers who absolutely do not share your enthusiasm. Most of them have been there for a long, long time. And rather than greet your enthusiasm and fresh ideas and energy with a warm embrace, or at least a sense of openness, they just shake their head as though to say, just wait until you've been here as long as me. And maybe they even resent that you were hired with a higher salary than they started with, and you get the same benefits they do. Now, this is to be expected from the world. Cynicism and hierarchies and taking people down a peg or two are commonplace and acceptable in the economics of the secular world. But the parable makes it very clear these are not characteristics of the kingdom of heaven. And sadly, they far too often are. I mean, it's quite common for new pastors, whether they be young or old, to graduate seminary or complete course of study and be all excited about starting a career in ministry with passion and ideas and vision. And when they get together with their new colleagues, right, other pastors, those pastors that have been doing it a long time, some of them don't greet them with open arms or allow their enthusiasm to spread. No, some of us, more seasoned colleagues, just shake our heads as though to say, oh, you just wait. You just wait and see how hard it is to pastor a church. Now take your place in that tiny church in the middle of nowhere where you belong. And maybe this happens to some extent sometimes in the church. You know, someone new to the faith or new to the church is excited and passionate about serving Jesus and wants to try new things, wants to reach out to new people. And rather than embrace their enthusiasm and try new things, the pastor or certain congregants just shake their head as though to say, yeah, we've tried that before. It doesn't work. You're excited now, but just wait until you see how hard it is to live out your faith when life is hard and when people reject you and when things don't turn out the way you hope they would. Now serve on 10 committees and then maybe we'll consider your ideas. Well, the parable makes it abundantly clear that God's grace and mercy is available to each and every one of us today. And that ought to fill us with a tremendous sense of gratitude and joy. For those of us who have been laboring for a long time, the kingdom of heaven continues to need us. Our wisdom, our experience, our long and steady commitment. And for those who have been laboring for a relatively short period of time, the kingdom of heaven needs you as well. Your passion, your energy, your fresh perspective. When it comes down to it, we are all on equal footing when it comes to the mercy and grace of God. Let us then commit to working together and appreciating one another as co-laborers in the vineyard that is the kingdom of heaven.